Now, today's webinar, as I said, will address the topic of AML transaction monitoring tuning, combining analytics and automation to reduce false positives automation. Our speaker today will be Ms. Deborah Geister. Deborah has spent 15 years in banking compliance and leadership roles. For 3 years, she worked for US Bank as a VP of Risk and Compliance. And for almost 10 years, Deborah worked at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, where she gained hands-on experience with big data, analytics, predictive modeling, and product strategy. So she brings a wealth of information with her today. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. On behalf of Matrix and myself, I sincerely appreciate your participation and look forward to the conversation. So just a little bit about Matrix IFS. Matrix is a global firm that really has done many successful compliance and implementation projects around the world. We have worked with Actimize, SAS, Oracle, FICO, all the usual suspects when it comes to the transaction monitoring solutions, and we work from an end-to-end perspective. We also are a market leader with specialized expertise and many years of experience in the banking industry specifically, and we really have a presence all around the globe. So if we can move to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the agenda that we're walking through today. And one thing I want to point out to you is that when we start talking about tuning and how we manage our systems on an ongoing basis, an hour is barely sufficient to be able to talk about the high level. So I apologize that I won't be able to cover all the detail, but I would welcome you to reach out if you have any specific questions. Submit those questions either through this dialogue or further dialogue down the road. So we look forward to more conversations around this topic. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda today. We're going to discuss the regulatory implications of tuning of systems and how that's evolved in the last couple of years. Managing AML risk and emerging typologies. What's the process that we use to be able to stay on top of things from a tuning perspective? How do we develop targeted detection scenarios and use customer segmentation and population groups, as well as defining those normal and outlier conditions throughout the process? And then finally, we'll talk about how we can also expand our operational improvement through the use of automation. So if we move to the next slide, let's jump right into the regulatory implications. Certainly, this is not something new. We've had motivations and direction from our regulatory agencies to be able to tune and manage our systems effectively and really to prove that they are doing what they are supposed to do. But when we look at regulation that's come out recently, like NYDFS 504, that certainly created another layer and another requirement for system effectiveness for anybody that's operating in New York. But one interesting thing about New York is that they seem to kind of set the tone, especially in the United States market, and certainly around the world as far as how we approach some of these problems. So the additional requirements for system effectiveness through DFS 504 are certainly of interest here. And one of the key factors that I like to look at is that 504 is not a very large document to be able to walk through, but there's one key issue that I want you to focus on, and that is the expansion of the definition of the responsibility from red flags or suspicious activities that we usually have detected today to illegal activities. So there is additional impetus for us to be able to be on the lookout for illegal activities, and it really holds us accountable as bankers for those illegal activities that occur through our organization. So that is a game changer. AML also continues to be an area of strong focus for the United States federal government, financial regulators, law enforcement. I know when the Trump administration took over, it was announced that this would be a major area of focus for Attorney General Sessions, and that was outlined in the ABA Bank Compliance publication back in 2017. And also, regulatory fines really are a top 5 loss event for any financial institution. The cost of a regulatory fine really is represented pretty strongly as a loss event for a financial institution. So if you look at the first day a fine is announced, typically stock values plummet about 5.5% on average. Now this is from a McKinsey.com study that was done, and you'll see there is a link to that particular article at the bottom of the page if you want to read more about that. But when you look at things like soft costs, remediation costs, and everything that goes into remediating a regulatory event, and I can speak from personal experience here, it is very, very costly. So this is obviously one of the reasons we want to tune and make sure that we are doing all we can in addition to operational considerations. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see that these are things right out of the headlines. So regulatory agencies are continuing to fine financial institutions for aiding, abetting, facilitating money laundering of terrorist organizations, sanctioned states, and criminal cartels, and that's represented here. These are not anything new or surprising to anybody, but certainly kind of illustrates that it's a very high focus for our financial regulators in this regard. So let's move to the next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about how you manage the emerging typologies, the changes that come within your organization. I'm going to spend some time talking to you a little bit about how we look at those things, those emerging typologies, and then I'll kind of tie it all together. But most of you should have something that looks a little like this in your operational process, right? In either an operational support team or several teams that really perform these functions. This is what I used when I was in a BSA role. I actually worked for a bank that was under a cease and desist order, and so we had to put a complete framework into place. And this is what we used to be able to do that. So we created a trends analysis committee that really looked at how things were evolving in the day-to-day operations in the AML department. We engaged both AML and fraud analysts that were part of this committee, and we tasked them to identify when there was something that was emerging or evolving. We set definitions for them, and they were kind of the front lines, if you will, to be able to look at defect analysis or trends that were occurring out in the data sets. Once we identified those trends, we then moved it into a typology. So a typology was set up to document and to identify those behavior patterns, as well as the demographics and the profile definitions that occurred. That was then pushed over to the strategy team. They created a complete strategy, both in the operational side and also in the system and detection side, to be able to roll that out. We then rolled those out into a testing environment with the change requirement to the system and the operations. Once they were passed, we did workflow procedures, moved those to production, and then reporting, and of course then the cycle started. It's a continual cycle really in this domain to be able to stay on top of those emerging typologies, the changes in your environment, and to identify that risk on an ongoing basis. So my point here is that regardless of what your process looked like, just make sure that you have a solid process to be able to stay on top of the changes within your organization on a regular basis. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and I don't have to tell most of you really what those are all about. I'm sure you live those on a regular basis, but from a detection perspective, false positives are basically something we've accepted as just really part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. They're based on our traditional detection logic is based on overly simplistic action-based rules that are basically resident within the system. They're not aligned with institution-specific risk assessments, and they're loosely, if at all, based on anything that really resembles money laundering behavior. So what happens because of these factors is we end up with 96 to 98% noise. Now that is something that we experienced personally. When I was at my financial institutions, we had very high false positive rates. Our threshold was 96%. We failed to identify bad actors and source illicit behaviors. What's occurring is that these threat groups that I'll talk about in a little bit are really laundering funds right under our noses. So if you look at our suspicious activity detection model logic, typically we see things like burst-in activity, historical deviation rules, daily messages from high-risk countries, security blanket. Those types of things are the general rules that we put in place, but what I would like to propose to you is that we take a look at how we improve those ratios and can really hone in on what the bad behavior looks like. So let's move to the next slide, please, which I believe is a polling question. So first polling question here, what is your transaction monitoring system's current false positive rate? So if you
Okay,
could answer the one.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
give
go
you a
ahead.
few moments to put in your answers to that. Just try and gauge sort of what everybody's false positive rate is and get a good idea of where we are. Yeah, it's going to wait a little bit longer for people to submit their votes for the polling question. Okay, we almost have a majority of people now. Just last few moments for everybody to submit. Excellent. We're going to probably go ahead and close the poll. Wow, look at that. Quite an even split. Is that something you were expecting, Deborah?
No, quite honestly, Anna. I want to talk to those people that are in the 0 to 60% range. I want to see what they're doing. But it's very interesting that we've got such a split down the middle. But we do have a large percentage, if you look at the majority, above 95%. And there was a study that was done a couple of years ago by another organization, and I believe Ernst & Young, and that revealed that our average across the industry was above 90%. And so it looks like many of you are in that category, and certainly it is challenging, even if you're in the 60% range, right? False positives are still a big factor in our operational budgets and how we man our organizations. One thing to keep in mind is that 45% on average of our AML budgets are actually going to dispositions of these false positives. So let's move back into our conversation if we can. And I appreciate your input and your answers to the polling question. So I want to talk a little bit about how we develop targeted detection scenarios. I'm going to walk you through kind of what the methodology is that we use to create those detection scenarios. I'm going to talk through how we typically look at current system scenarios and how we tune those, and then how we bring the two together. So I will get you to the end, I promise. So we look at 4 different factors, and we kind of categorize them very simply as who, how, where, and what. So who do we target? And it's not what you think it would be. We really look at transnational threat organizations or transnational criminal organizations. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. How they do what they do, what are the typologies and the emergent trends that we see within these threat groups? Where are they targeting funds? Where are they moving funds? And we'll look at a multi-tiered country risk profile, as well as targeted what we call fund flows. We'll talk about that. And also, what are the specific banking products that they use and how do they use them? So let's move into the who. When we start talking about money laundering that occurs through the majority of our financial institutions, I will tell you with absolute certainty that 99% of all the money laundering that occurs is done through these transnational threat organizations. So it is not just something that we see lone actors doing, but it's really focused on what we call the hybrid threat. And the hybrid threat is really focused on the interconnected global nature of these threat groups, right? They're related, they work together, and that's a whole webinar in and of itself. But I will tell you that we know with pretty strong certainty from our work with the government sector and from the work in the intelligence community that many of these threat groups are related and they have their own DNA. So for example, if I look at somebody like Hezbollah or ISIS, which we refer to as Daesh here, those groups have different tradecraft when it comes to money laundering and how they do what they do. Okay, so if you see here, there's several of the fund flows that we talked about. I'll get into that in a little bit, but as you can see, we've moved funds from Turkey through the UAE to Afghanistan. That's typically an ISIS pattern. From UAE as the originating bank, the customer is in Turkey, through Switzerland to Yemen, Turkey to Pakistan. And you'll see that the common denominator here is that our originating customer always is in Turkey and ends up in Afghanistan, Yemen, or Pakistan. That's indicative of what we saw when money was exiting the caliphate in the ISIS movement. So that occurred about a year ago. But my point is here, these are threat groups that are highly sophisticated. They're organized like multinational corporations. And so they're not unsophisticated. They are very, very good at what they do. So the who think transnational threat organizations or criminal organizations. So let's move to the next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about how. we use as a methodology a typology matrix, and a typology matrix really is a tool to be able to build the base as our detection strategy. So we tie that back to the risk assessment. So risk assessment is our foundation. We then move to a typology matrix, and that gives us a graphic illustration of that risk. When we start talking about these transnational threat organizations, it's a way that we can track them and how they move money and how they do what they do. So that how really becomes that typology matrix that shows us the stages of residual risk, any gaps and solutions to improve our coverage. This really is the bridge to be able to show our regulators as to how exactly we select our rules within our system and our coverage. So it is a good methodology to be able to work with, and it also is a good tool for audit and model validation practices because it gives us a solid foundation. You'll see an example on the screen. Everybody has a little bit different typology matrix potentially, but this is an example of how we look at this from an action-centric and an actor-centric detection. We also apply the products that are at play, as well as geographic risk, and then we'll put some of the conditional data down the other axis to be able to show what those different threats and pieces of the puzzle kind of look like. So let's move to the next slide, please. The where, we're really going to talk about how we detect things from an inherent risk environment in our geographies. So this is an example of an actual wire pattern that we saw that involved Turkey, Hong Kong. You'll see everywhere we've identified Hezbollah in red, these fund flows, right, that we see movement of funds from Turkey to Hong Kong to Paraguay. Paraguay is a very high-risk jurisdiction, especially when you talk about Shiite terrorist finance, counterfeit goods, corruption, money laundering, and second-tier sanctions evasion. So Paraguay is a very high-risk jurisdiction from that regard when it comes to Hezbollah. The US, UAE, and also Brazil, right? So if you identify those things in the patterns, we see that Hezbollah typically moves funds here, and you'll see high risk designated for each of these different areas. So geography is important, not just from the perspective of the origin and the destination, but also where are the funds flowing and where's the destination headed, right? So the full pattern of what we call the fund flows. So let's move to the last slide, which is really going to be focused on what. When we look at the what, we look at the product risk and its relationship to high risk use. So from a Hezbollah perspective, I think I mentioned that Hezbollah and all transnational threat organizations really are focused on different stages, just like we would see in a corporation. So you'll have your international strategic level, and at that level they use different products than they do at the regional level, at the domestic support level, and at the tactical level. So don't look at product risk as just a singular dimension, but understand where it can be used and how it is used by these different threat organizations that may exploit our organizations. Let's move to the next slide if we can. So one thing I want to lay out for your consideration is really the multidimensional nature of risk. We tend to look at things from a singular dimension, and that is a bit of a challenge when you start thinking about a country or even a person. If you think about what risk looks like, we tend to amalgamate it all together and create an overall risk rating for a specific country. In this example, we've got country XYZ that is a medium risk on the Basel Index. It's a low risk from a conflict perspective, but it's a very high risk from a drug trafficking and a high corruption risk. So what we've done then in most indexes is we've created an overall risk condition of medium. Now, does that really make sense if you're looking for things like drug trafficking, the movement of drugs and illicit substances? That probably doesn't make sense. So what I would propose to you is that look at risk from a different perspective. Look at it from what we're trying to detect. So if I'm looking for the typical movement of funds by Hezbollah from the Korangal Valley of Afghanistan, for example, and how those drugs transition, if I'm targeting that in my scenarios, that should be a very high indicator when we see those patterns. As opposed to sanctions evasion, in this case, this example, it's a very low risk. So if we're looking for things like second-tier sanctions evasions, that would be a much lower risk profile. So I would encourage you not to focus on things that are going to push everything into a singular category, right? Because it is going to create performance issues with your rules, and it just doesn't make sense from a tuning perspective, right? And it also doesn't tie back to your bank's risk assessment scenarios. It just doesn't make sense across the board. So look at things from a multi-dimensional perspective. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about how we actually go about developing targeted detection scenarios. When we look at how we get much more specific and focused in on how these threat groups are operating and how money is actually laundered through our banks, we really look at 6 different levels or layers that we put into play. First is the global threat landscape. And again, this may vary based on the type of environment or business unit we're focused on. Our risk from a retail perspective may look very different than it would here in a correspondent lending situation or a correspondent banking situation. So make sure that you take that into account. But this specific pattern of development really looks first at the global threat landscape. So I talked about those fund flows and looking at multiple risk scores by jurisdiction that are based on threats. We also look at the inherent risk environment, which is your institutional specific risk profile of the geographic nexus, the products and the product mix that you have out in the marketplace, your customer and counterparty risk profile, and any financial institutions that you're doing business with in the case of correspondents. So that inherent risk environment is going to inform how we create those rules. We also look very specifically at actor definitions. Good customer, right? How do we define that good customer transaction versus a bad actor? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about setting our specific threshold and pieces of the puzzle. Typology matrix is a way to cross-reference the inherent risk. We've talked about them a little bit, but it really focuses on our typologies that we see, those threat classifications and groups, and a way to create rules that determine that residual risk and to be able to mitigate those rules. And our scenario development, it drives a couple of things. It drives our system logic, right, creating the rules within the system, and it also helps inform our training, which is very important because we need to make sure that our staff is very well-versed on the prescribed scenarios and threats that we have in our organization so that they're looking for the right things. So let's move to the next slide, if you will, please. Which brings us to another polling question. How often do you tune or test your system rules today? What does that look like for you?
Yep, so once again, we're just going to give you a few moments to answer that question of how often do you tune or test your system rules? Is it constantly, monthly, quarterly? Is it just annually, or have you never tuned or tested your system rules? So yeah, just give you a few moments to answer that. Good, looks like most people have already answered, so just a few more moments and then we'll go ahead and close the poll. Excellent. It looks like most people said annually, but just by a little, so it looks a little bit split as well.
Yeah, about 51% it looks like are doing an annual review, which is expected, right? That's what we're required to do in most cases, whether it's OCC, DFS, or FDIC. Typically, they do expect at least annually. So, but I like the fact that we see about 22% that are continually and constantly managing that change and managing the risks. So that's wonderful. And several at quarterly, some at monthly, right? So good answers. I like to see the distribution, and it's interesting. So thank you again for your answers and for your feedback. So let's talk a little bit about. I'm going to move into how we traditionally set rules, right? So we've got our traditional scenarios that I talked about earlier that we set, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we start that process, how we identify where we set thresholds, how we do normal versus outliers, and then how we kind of bring that together in the stages of tuning. So one of the first exercises, and probably one of the more critical ones, is really to identify how we segment our populations and set the baseline for our rule thresholds. Segmentation is critical because, right, not all groups act the same. So if I have a consumer versus a commercial account, obviously those thresholds are going to be very different between those two groups. So I want to make sure that I understand what those like and kind segmentation practice or segmentation groups really look like, right? So you'll see in some of these diagrams, these are some of the tools that we use. The clustering analysis is a very strong piece to be able to take a look at how those population groups kind of shake out. And what we're looking for is, where do most normal customers within the group fall? How do they behave? How do we make that normal definition? And then where are the outliers that start to show us risk so that we can start to do what we call cutting off the tail, right? That's a typical fraud term, but we look at how we can identify some of those patterns of behavior and set that definition. That definition for any system and detection settings is really critical because it informs our systems to be able to tell it how to look for bad behavior, right? And that's why I think there's so much focus from a regulatory perspective at understanding why you set the thresholds you did and where you set them. You have to be able to defend that position as you speak to your regulators. Our clustering shows us kind of how our segmentation breaks out, and then we really look at starting the threshold setting by looking at some of the movement, right? So the percentile range of change, so that we can start to identify where we see high risk from a baseline perspective, medium risk, low risk, et cetera. So the data will kind of be represented in this manner when we do a typical tuning scenario to be able to start that threshold discussion. Now, it gives you an opportunity to have a standard to work from that you can defend, again, with your regulators, right, and be able to move into the next rounds of tuning. So it is a pretty critical step in the process. And again, these tools to be able to analyze, I'd love to go into further detail, and we can probably spend an hour just on that. But just suffice it to say that there are some clear methodologies that we would love to have conversations around. And if you've got other ones that you're using successfully, we'd love to hear about that as well. So let's move into the next slide that shows us kind of our next round, which is more about the sensitivity analysis. So once we have set our threshold and we've got a starting point for our testing, we're really looking at probing that line, if you will, to be able to see where there are opportunities and needs for us to move the line above or below where we've started. So this is an example of cash deposit structuring activity in personal accounts specifically, when we've got above the line and below the line testing results. You'll see where we've got the gray dots, where we've got false positives that have occurred in the threshold settings. And then the red dots represent where we see interesting activity or potentially suspicious. In this case, we've set a threshold at $7,000 for that structuring activity. We do see some activity that is occurring that's interesting that drops down into the 6,000 range or just a little bit above. So in this case, we'd be looking to move that line down as the first set of testing requirements as a follow-up for the next phase. So if we move to the next slide. In this case, we've done that tuning round one, as we just talked about and just represented to you. So for example, we're going to take a daily messages to high-risk customers example. In the originator account key, we're looking for a 30-day time frame, swift wire transfers with a $5,000 lower bound threshold and 2 occurrences or more over 30 days. In this case, when we ran some testing scenarios, we saw 100,000 alerts in 90 days, right, with a 2% escalation rate, so about 2,000 alerts. The cost of that then was 45 minutes per alert, or 750,000 man hours in 90 days, right? Because of the noise in this scenario, we're looking at 98% false positive rate, and it's going to turn the organization upside down, right? That's a lot of man hours to be able to cover in 90 days to be able to define the risk. So our next round would really focus us on how do we create those population groups. The timeframes, we will look at how we adjust those timeframes to a more realistic threshold, what our values look like, and what our volumes look like. So if we move to the next slide, it'll show us kind of what our approach is in round two, which is now we've got some different population groups that we've identified. We've got an individual or consumer population group that is defined in round one. We've done our clustering analysis on. We've created a time frame of 5 days instead of 30, all right? And we've looked at aggregate points for the different values and for volumes, right? So these are the different testing scenarios that we've defined for each of these categories. Our result is that we've got alerts of that number of about 5,000 in 90 days, a 4% escalation rate, and a rule cost, again, at 45 minutes per alert, working with our average at 3,750 man-hours in 90 days. Now, a significant drop, right? But still a little high because we've got investigator that performs 10 alerts a day, 50 a week, 900 in 90 days. That'll cost us 4 full-time FTEs just for one rule. Now, we can't tune to those results, but we want to make sure that we balance out our productivity rate, right, of the rule with the organizational considerations so that we make sure we get the right balance. But what this tells me is that the costs are still a little high, and I'd like to look at a third round of tuning. That's really where we start looking at bringing together our worlds between our precision detection and our standards and some of those other details. So we look at things like artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, input outputs. You know, if we want to look at data quality, but we also want to look at how we can apply additional factors or attributes to our detection logic to be able to really cull it down and get it into a much more workable range that the organization can handle and that still very strongly justifies our position from a regulatory perspective. So let's move to the next slide, please. So let me give you a set of results that is kind of a real-world scenario where we created that additional layer, that precision typology. And in this case, we were focused specifically on human trafficking. What we did is we created a defined set of conditions, if you will, and we looked at different factors. There were multiple MCC codes that we looked at. We looked at geographic risk, at specific websites and spend pattern that we saw on those websites, and travel expenditures as our defined conditions. What we required in the rule selection or the rule settings is that there had to be 3 conditions present at a minimum for a rule to fire instead of a single condition. And what that did is it really drove our result sets into a much more cohesive and a much more manageable level. So if we looked at the first 90 days of rule launch, we saw 775 alerts generated, and we had 612 that were pushed to a full file. So we filed SARs on those. In that case, instead of having a 96% false positive ratio, we actually drove to an 18% false positive ratio, which drove our false positives to down by 81%. So that is very significant. To be able to drive down our false positive ratios by 80% is absolutely phenomenal. So this was kind of the starting point of us saying, you know what, there's something here. If we get much more specific and logical and pragmatic about how we target our risk, we really can hone in and minimize some of the impacts and the bad or negative things that we see within transaction monitoring false positives for our organizations. So I think that, yeah, go ahead.
Correct. Could you possibly just tell the audience what an MCC code is?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. MCC codes are merchant classification category. So that is a standard spend. If you're seeing anything that's coming usually through the cards, the card rails, if you will, so Visa, MasterCard, and some of those systems, we have MCC codes that are assigned to each and every transaction. We actually looked at the transactional data to be able to identify patterns of behavior in the BADs that we identified. We kind of used a bit of a predictive analytics model to be able to look at those MCC codes and where they reoccurred across our known filed SARs within the organization. So thank you for pointing that out, Anna.
Yeah, no problem. We also have somebody else asking, what does the clustering analysis consist of? Like each rule or group of rules?
Sure, that's a great question. So the clustering analysis, what we're looking for is, if you think about clustering, it really is taking a whole bunch of disparate pieces of the puzzle and trying to classify them and group like and kind. So when we look at a clustering analysis, we're looking for like behaviors and like attributes for customers, whether it be a commercial customer or a consumer customer. We're really looking for how those patterns start to define themselves And I don't want to get too into the weeds because I could talk all day about that. But it really is an exercise that's very important for you to start to be able to segment your population and look at how your certain customers behave in a similar fashion, right? So our segments can align around a number of different things, as I mentioned, consumer and commercial, but they can also align around spend patterns, behavior patterns, geography. All of those things that we use in our risk assessment are things that we can look at from a clustering perspective. Good stuff. Thank you for that question. So let's talk about some of our operational side of the equation. On average, how much time do your investigative analysts spend per alert?
Okay, so poll number 3. I'm just going to give you a few moments to submit your answers to this poll. Yeah, I know. I don't want to influence anyone anyway, but I hope it's not more than 8 hours. It won't be interesting to see what people say. Looks like a majority of people have done it, and here we go. The answers is, it looks like most people say less than an hour.
Yeah.
Is that something you expect?
Yeah. Yep. I would hope so. That's great. That's good news. From personal experience, when we started the journey and we started applying some of these rules, I think before operational improvements, we actually were at, I want to say 4 hours. We were able to, with a system implementation and improved operations, we were able to drive that down to 10 minutes. So again, you're talking about a very significant reduction in cutting some of the fat out of the processes. So I think that it's good news that we're less than an hour. You still have some that we get into some complexities, and it again depends on your business model. Some of them just take longer, but certainly it's good news that we're strongly under less than an hour. I'm glad we didn't have too many over 8 hours.
Yeah, Deborah, can you just, before we move on, can you just tell me, someone's asking what's meant by specific website spend?
Sure, yeah. So specific website spend, in the case of the example that I showed you, we were very focused on human trafficking. And one of the things that we saw was very strong spend back when Backpage was a factor. It was one of the things that we saw spend on. And it was kind of a key to us that when we saw that website spend, whether it was something like Backpage or some other sites that we tracked, and I do have a list of those sites I can share. But when we saw those kind of website spend activity, we knew that it was likely part of a human trafficking ring or human trafficking scenario. So again, it falls into MCC code, but when you look at some of the activity in the transactional data, we could see very clearly that it was going to places like Backpage.com. So that's really one of our detection factors.
Okay, great.
So, we've talked a little bit about how do we get the false positive ratios down. I think there are a lot of opportunities around RPA or robotic process automation to be able to take some of those rote things that our investigators do on a regular basis, whether it be just pulling data together or whatever that looks like. We can also start to drive those timelines down, right? Because some of those things that consume the most time for our investigators are the things that really net us the least amount of value. So RPA or the process automation is really one of the additional tools that we can look at to be able to drive those numbers down and to manage the operational side of the equation. And I'd like to hand off at this point to Raj. Raj is from Matrix, and he and I have done many tuning projects together and spent many late nights kind of poring over statistical data and driving these kinds of projects. Raj is very experienced at Matrix, has spent many years in the industry, and I'm going to let him talk about that. So Raj, I will hand off to you.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you so much for the informative session. I hope everyone can hear me well. Once again, I thank you everyone for taking time to join us for this webinar. So far, what we learned was, how do we use analytics and how to use analytics to tune our AML models and rules, right? And if you look at it, I think like up and until last year, like when you talk about tuning, and we were mostly looking at, hey, how do we reduce the false positives, right? Going back to our, the polling question, across the industry, so financial institutions are facing about 60% or 60% or more false positives, right? False positives are something that you cannot get rid of, right? So what we have done with our customers is that, like, once you have the false positives in the system, how do we improve your operational procedures or operational tasks that could result in that could reduce a lot of manual effort when it comes to alert investigations, case investigations, and whatnot, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so when you talk about RPA, right, the constant, the problem we have across the industry is we are dealing with, most of the times we are dealing with a lot of false positives, right? I think, like, we had about 26% saying we have 90% or more false positives across the AML systems, right? And also the day-to-day the regulations and the requirements presenting new challenges, right? You're not you are introducing, the financial institutions are introducing a new way of investigating alerts, gathering data from 20 different source systems and whatnot, right? If you look at it, right, analysts, they actually spend about 80% of their time, pulling data from different sources, whether it is internal system or external system, or doing some sort of screening against their sanctions database, or screening against their negative news database and whatnot, right? So 80% of the time they actually spend pulling data from different systems, and they relatively spend like very less time, about 20% of time, to make a decision, right? And then the other issue is inconsistencies, right? For example, an analyst marks a certain alert or an entity as a false positive, but at the same time another analyst could mark the same entity as false negative. It's a true alert, right? So there are inconsistencies when it comes to investigation, right? And how do we make sure the inconsistencies are not happening within this investigations environment, and how do we make sure there's a constant knowledge sharing or information sharing across the investigators so the decisions are always consistent? And as I said before, over half of the time the investigators are spending time, investigators are spending time on collecting the data rather than investigating or spending more time on working on the true alerts, true positives. So some of the known issues, right, I think, which we already covered: the manual tax and cost calculations, right, and then high turnover of resources, right? Because if you look at this, the level 1 review across the board, I think that's prone to we have seen that operational side is prone to high turnover of resources, and also the resources that they are dealing with, investigations processes, they are not most of the times technical resources, right? I mean, they just follow certain rules and procedures, manual processes to investigate an alert. Next slide, please. So now, how do we overcome all these challenges, right? So when you think about RPA, robotic process automation, people tend to think that this is more of the tool or technique that is going to help with reducing false positives, or this is going to reduce the investigation intensity, right? I mean, that is not the right way of looking at RPA, right? RPA is not going to help you to reduce the false positives. I mean, the previous session we had, where Deb explained how do we develop very targeted precision rules and models, and then how do we use analytics to reduce the false positive alerts at the first place, right? So once you have built a very target specific behavior based models and rules, and how do we manage the remaining false positives, right? How do we make our investigators spend relatively less time on false positives and have them spend more time on true alerts, right? RPA can help in two modes. One is the active mode, where the investigators can actually request more information as and when they investigate an alert, right? For example, a user is investigating an alert. He wants to get more information about his transactional behavior over a period of time, right? So instead of the user going to multiple systems from the investigation platform itself, we can build bots that will serve such on-screen and ad hoc requests, right? And in a passive mode, right? So over a period of time, the system can learn, right? From your policies, procedures, or from your the manual processes, right? And see, okay, these are all the key information that will be required for investigating an alert, right? And making sure that information is readily available for the investigators, when the alert is generated, right? So when an alert is generated, when they open an alert, so they're gonna see all the information they need for the investigation to support the investigation on the alert itself, instead of manually logging into different systems and getting the information that they need. Next slide, please. Yes. So this is some of the immediate improvements we have done for our customers, right? Leveraging their existing case management platform, right? I mean, across the industry, I'm pretty sure every one of you started hearing about RPA and whatnot. But some of our customers really got into this space and said and tried exploring some sort of a POC to see how this can really help to optimize the investigation process, right? So, for example, if you look at it, this is a snapshot of what you see in an alert, right? So when an alert is created, the investigator is going to see not necessarily what is the rule that triggered that alert, right? In addition to that, so how the entities involved in this alert related to other entities, right? And how this alert is related to other rules and models, and also what is the profiles of the customer involved in this alert, any negative news information about the customer, and giving you right away on the screen where the customer addresses and whether those addresses are shared by multiple entities or not. Is there any suspicious behavior going on there? And then also, as I mentioned, like ad hoc request right from your alert screen to pull additional data as you need for investigating that alert. Next slide, please. So I promise the one last polling question. Which stage is your organization in implementing an RPA solution?
Okay, so last poll. We're just going to give you a few moments again. So what stage is your organization in implementing an RPA solution? Do you already have an RPA solution? Are you evaluating it? Is it planned in your budget? Let us know by voting now. Okay, quite a few people have voted. Almost there we go. It looks a little bit split again, actually.
Great. I mean, thank you for taking time answering this question. And this is pretty much in line with what we are seeing across the industry, right? I think I take my customers as a representative sample. Looking at it, yes, a lot of the banks, a lot of the financial institutions started looking at RPA. Started evaluating whether that could be a good fit for for improving their operational efficiency or not, right? So I can talk about from one of my recent experiences that. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yes. So this is one of our the recent POC around RPA, right? So this is one of the commercial bank in the US, right? So when we actually sat with their investigators, to understand their process and policies, right? So we found out that about 30% of the time they were they are spending about 30 minutes for investigating an alert, right? And if you look at it, out of those 30 minutes, they were actually spending about 25 minutes. Just by looking at the alert itself, they can figure it out. This is a false positive, right? But then they also has to go through the typical investigation process, right? So data collection and whatnot. So for the data collection, they were spending about 20-25 minutes, right? And then once they have the data, they were just quickly making the decision as to whether it's a false positive or this alert needs to be escalated, right? So what we built was we built about 5 to 6 different bots, right? What the bots do is they connect to different internal source systems within the bank, right? And then they also connect to external systems, well-known systems like LexisNexis, or if they have their negative screening licensing from their negative screening vendor. So it connects to different systems and pull the data from those systems and show it to the user right on the alert screen, right? So what happened was, after we implemented this 6 different bots, the alert investigation time reduced from 30 minutes to 10 minutes, because they had the data what they need in the alert itself, right? All they need to do is they have to validate the data and just make the decision, dispersion the alert, right? So on an average, they were processing about 400 alerts per day, but after the implementation of this bots, the RPA processes, they were able to investigate about 1,200 alerts, right? And this also is true for the cases. So they were investigating about 250 cases a day, and after this RPA, they were able to investigate about 800 alerts, which is 3 times more than what they did before, right? And the biggest advantage of this RPA process is that, right, I mean, as and when you see emerging risks or threats, what you're going to do is you're going to tune your system, or you're going to put in additional rules and models, so which could actually, result in more alerts, right? Obviously, you don't want to go and hire hundreds of analysts, to investigate those alerts, or to investigate any operation, increase in alert volumes. So instead, the banks trying to optimize their existing process and procedures, so and how effectively they can leverage the existing workforce, as well as the latest tools and techniques for optimizing the process and improving the alert investigation process. Next slide. Yeah, so these are some of the benefits of the RPA, which we pretty much covered it. So obviously, it's a fast operations processes. The work is done by the system, the bots. So there is no manual intervention. So the processor, you can achieve fast operational processes, and also training, right? Less training because you are going to pretty much automate your manual tasks, right? And you don't need to oversee if your analysts are making any mistakes or not, because the bots will do the work, and they are going to spend more time on what is really important for for investigating the alert. And it is fully audited. So obviously when systems doing the work, you have to have a well-established audit process, so you can defend in front of your regulators. So RPA is fully audited, and increase the team efficiency. I think we saw that in the previous slide. They were able to move from 300, 400 alerts a day to 1,200 alerts a day, and also it's optimized accuracy, right? When it comes to data gathering or data manipulation or data transformation, if you use with Excel sheet, if you play with Excel sheet, you tend to make mistakes. But then, when you automate it, so the chances of making mistakes is relatively low, right? I mean, the bots don't make mistakes, right? And lower risk. What I mean by lower risk is that you will see a consistency across your investigations platform, because the information is shared across the investigators, and then there is a constant knowledge sharing. So there is low risk of making repetitive mistakes, and it is cost saving also, right? RPA can be a self-funding project for any of your other compliance projects, right? Because you're not going to be keep on hiring investigators. Instead, you're optimizing your existing processes, keeping your investigators the staffing level at where it is now, and the year-on-year operational savings could actually help you to put more efforts into tuning of your systems, or looking at other areas of improvements within the compliance space. And it is scalable. RPA is scalable, right? For example, one of the recent experiences, we built very relatively easy bots, and then if you want to scale it across the enterprise wide, yes, you could do that. Next slide, please.
Okay. Now's the time when we're going to take some questions from the audience. Just a reminder that if you do want to ask a question, just submit them in the question pod on the control panel, and we'll go ahead and ask our expert speakers. Deborah, this question is actually for you.
Okay.
Are you there? Oh, good.
I am.
Yeah. So this question is that it appears there's a different process for precision logic development, and we can't run dual process. So how do precision scenarios align with traditional tuning?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So I don't think they have to be disparate or separate. I think that your precision detection, as I alluded to, we go through several rounds of tuning a traditional rule. We always start with that as a basis for our foundation, if you will, and we work from there. So as we go through the tuning rounds, when we get to the third round, when we really have to hone in and start to get detailed about narrowing down and focusing on the right alerts out of the system. That's where we start to apply additional attributes, and we start to apply additional layers to be able to really make that rule robust and much more precision oriented. So I think that it aligns from the perspective that we're never going to say, throw all your other scenarios away, but where we see high pain point rules, we want to make those precision rules by kind of honing in. So for example, if it's in the correspondent lending and we're looking at to and from high-risk jurisdictions, how do we start to take that baseline and now start to really target? So I think they do complement each other very well.
Okay, and I guess the follow-up question would be, does one focus on precision logic, or does one keep their existing rules?
Well, I think that's that's a good question. I think they do both. So I think that you look at this from a holistic risk perspective and be able to identify, where we have some opportunities to be able to do a better job from a false positive perspective, maybe even from a false negative perspective. And we have to be able to create a mix of standard rules and precision rules to start to create that balance. It's a tricky proposition. It's not one that we're real comfortable or used to yet, but I think that it will evolve as we start tackling this problem much more efficiently, especially with the advent of things like AI and machine learning. I think they give us tools, but the thing we have to remember about that is that we've got to give those systems a referential data point, right? So how do we define bad? That's really the critical component in this whole process.
Okay, thank you. Another question is how do you deal with attribution issues where many different scenarios are investigated at once? Which ones get quote unquote credit for the escalation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, because in some systems, of course, you're going to get multiple because of the way we roll up and do consolidated work items. So I think that you have to look, and it depends on the system that you're in. The attribution really should be focused on what were the strongest scenarios that we saw that were presented. And you also have to look at this from the results perspective, right? So when we got to the end of the investigation cycle and we looked at what the driving factor and what the root cause was for this specific condition or case, then we have to go back and kind of apply our attribution. So I think you have to do a postmortem, as well as also taking a look at how they contributed within the system and make sure those two things are aligned.
Okay, great. Lastly, I think I'm just going to ask, because a few people have asked now throughout the webinar about RPA.
Sure.
Just sort of explain to us what RPA is and how it uses AI.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So RPA, and Raj, feel free to chime in here, but RPA is a robotic process automation. As Raj explained, we really use bots. So it's a case where bots are a good thing, right? We use bots to go out and do some of the processes that are time intensive and manual for our investigators. So for example, when I pull up an alert screen, I go out and I pull a Google search, or I go out and do a map utility, or whatever those steps are that I typically do in my investigations. RPA allows us to be able to take all of that information and present it into a nice case file so that when the investigator opens that alert, it's there. So I think the AI really comes from understanding how that investigation process works and being able to pull in some of those mechanisms as the machine learns, as the investigation unfolds, it kind of anticipates, right, and allows us to be able to take a look at what's going to occur, kind of predict what that's going to look like, and bring that in for the analysts so that we're not taking manual time to do that. Because every minute that we apply from a manual perspective costs the organization dollars, right? I've got a little calculator that shows what that looks like as far as how the manual intervention really costs us money as an organization, and that's one area we can really start to impact those costs downward.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deborah. I think we've gone a little bit over time, so I'm just probably going to go ahead and conclude the webinar for today. So just a special thanks to our speakers, Deborah and Raj, for sharing their practical knowledge and experience with us today. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us. Just a last reminder, if we go to the next slide, our next webinar will actually take place in 2 days' time on September 20th, and will focus on Latin America and the Caribbean and how to monitor client transactions for corruption risks. So please do go to www.moneylaundering.com to register for that one today. Lastly, I would be grateful if you could just take a moment to fill out a short survey before you leave the webinar. And on behalf of the NoMoneyLaundering.com team, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I wish you a great day further. Thank you.